Welcome everyone, my name is Mick Knutson. I would like to go through in this tutorial the proxy pattern. Now, I have seen many different examples and I want to try to make a very simple example to show some of the things that we can do with the proxy pattern. Now first, I personally like using visual aids to describe some of the patterns and the solutions and designs. So I am actually using a tool called Visual Paradigm. Now you do not need the Enterprise Edition. There is a community edition of this tool, and to be honest, there are many other UML based tools that can help understand and diagram a software problem space. So I'm just going to use this tool. Now let's start first with a simple example of just trying to create a client, and I'm going to call this my client application or my client class. And in my client class, I would like to also be able to create another interaction with this client, and I want this to be an interface. Now the reason we want this to be an interface is so that we can have some abstraction, and this is actually going to allow us to use the proxy pattern in practice. So it is a good idea to call things, create an interface. Now for the sake of the software pattern, I'm going to call this the subject. Now the subject is in question what the client is actually using. So I'm diagramming this here. Now the client uses the subject. Now, as we know with an interface, we cannot implement an interface. We must have some type of concrete class. So in order to do that, let's just say we're going to create another class that is going to be our implementation. Now, for this, let's call this the target. Now, this target is actually going to be what we actually will be realizing as the subject, or let me write something else down that I like to call this. I like to call this my contract. Okay. Now the subject is a contractual obligation. Anybody using this contract, in order to have an actual target implement that contract, that target must implement everything within the subject because it is contractually obligated to do so. Okay, now in this, let's just draw this, okay? Now I'm not going to fill everything in here because what I'm going to do, let's actually just go to some code and let's do a simple example. Now in code, let's say we have a subject. Now I've created a project, and this project will be available on GitHub later. Now I've created a subject, and what I'd like to do is let's create a couple contractual obligations, right? So let's just say that I would like to create something that returns an integer, and let's just say we'll call this an operation returning numeric value, right? I mean, again, it doesn't matter what the name is. I'm trying to show that we can create something. Oh, and of course we're not in our interface. We're not implementing it yet. We're just going to create a contractual obligation returning an integer. For this example, I want to go through a couple, and let's actually do another one that returns a string, and we'll call this an operation returning a string value, right? So two simple operations. Now, I am going to use Junit, which is built into most IDEs, including Eclipse, but as you see here, I'm using IntelliJ, but it will work exactly the same way in each of the IDEs. So I've got a subject, And if I'm going to go down and I'm going to create a unit test, I've created one called the Proxy Pattern test. And I've got only two things that I've actually set up here. Now, the two things that I've set up here are, we'll look at these. Oops, let's do this a little bit differently. Two things are, I've created a subject, which is what my client is wanting to use, will be using. Now, this unit test happens to be my client at this point, although I will create another one as an example in a second. Now, I've created a method that before I run individual test cases, I'm going to run this method before each test case, and I'm right now nullifying the subject, but it is already null. We're going to do something in a second with it. And I've created one @test method. This is a singular test, and this tests a simple client subject. That's all it's going to do. So, and kind of going through test-driven development at the same time, let's actually go through and see what we actually have here. So first of all, we know we have a subject, and if I was to say, subject dot, now if you notice, I actually have these operations. They won't work yet because I don't have implementation, but I still have them contractually obligated. So let's say I've got this numeric operation, and the numeric operation, let's just call this an int, and we'll call this an int result equals my numeric operation. And let's just start with there for one simple example, and at least from the client standpoint. Now, what we're missing happens to be the target. Okay, now the target has nothing right now. Now, if we decide to implement the subject, we're actually going to get a problem here, right? It actually says that we must implement these various operations. So what we're going to do is we are going to code, we're going to, let's just actually create one. Let's say it's going to be a public, and it's going to be an int, and it's going to be, let's call this, right? Right, look at the subject. Let's do our operation that returns numeric value, and we're going to put an implementation here. Now, as we see right off the bat, if we decide to return some kind of, number, let's just say that it's 42, I mean, that would work for that operation, but that may not be what I want. Now, let me do one other so I can get rid of this error we have. We're going to implement the public string, and we're going to return the string value. Now, at least now we've contractually obligated to the target. Now, one thing that wasn't done, and I like doing this, I really like doing this just for readability, I'm going to put in an override to make sure we know that these operations are both overriding what's in the subject. Now, for this example, I think I want to do something a little different so I can actually have some changes. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to go back over to here, and I'm just going to say, I'm going to call this an int, and let's just call this some kind of input. And now I'm going to modify my target that says I have an int, and it is going to be my input. Okay, so now I can say my input can be, let's just call this input plus equals 42. It's something simple. We're just trying to show an example here in just a minute. Now, I'm not going to do anything with the int operation thus far, what I'm going to do, or the string operation, but we're going to go back over to here, and we have an int result that we should actually be able to use. And let's just say that, I don't know, number 7 seems to be valid for me right now. So we're going to do this as 7, right? And the next thing we're going to do, we are going to do a simple assertion, assert equals, and we're going to do, let's do assert equals, Let's just do something different here, right? And right, import the class, right? Okay, assert equals what? Well, we're going to say the int result is equal to, again, let's just call it 0, just to make sure to see what we actually get. And don't need that. So we're verifying that our code actually works. Now, all we usually have to do is we're going to actually run this specific class, or in Eclipse, you'll run it as a JUnit test case. And this is actually going to run through and cause a problem in our test pattern test, which happens to be, hey, we haven't created a subject yet. Absolutely not. We have the contract and we can build to it. However, we need an implementation and we don't have one. So that's successful. So let's actually create one. Now remember, we've already created a target class, and let's call this a new target as the implementation for this subject. Now, the real piece is here. This is our acting as our client. Okay, so let's rerun this again. Rerunning this, okay, it compiles, it goes out up to date, and it runs. However, as you see here, we actually still kind of have a problem, though, right? So, but it's not an error, not a compilation error. It's a very simple problem. Now let's look at the problem in our console. Scrolling up here, the problem happens to be this. Very simply, right? Our equation said we expected 49, but we got 0. Okay, we can fix that. We should expect it to be 49. Rerunning this test, now we actually have a simple unit test that actually passes correctly. Now, let's modify this a little bit. Let's do a int result, right? And let me create another one just like this, just so I have some information and we have at least part of the blog finished. Let's do an @test. I'm going to do a public void, and we're going to enter this. We're going to do a string result, and in the string result, now we're going to do something again very similar. We're going to say that we have a subject dot string result, and we're going to go through the same thing we did a second ago, right? So I'm going to say a string, I'll call this my result, and let's just say we have string some kind of input. Okay, now of course some of this doesn't work, right? Because there's actually a problem with this. So let's first fix our subject. So our subject must take a string. We'll call this also input. So now we have a string input, but our target's going to be wrong now. So we're going to actually say I want a string input. And for this matter, let's assume to take, let's make a prefix colon space, and let's add our input to this. Now we have some kind of return value that we're modifying both on a string and an integer. Now, if we see this, get string result, and we need, oh, that's not what we need. We need actually a subject dot operation that returns this string value. So now we have a value, and now what we'd like to do is we'd like to do the assert equals, and we're going to say the result is equal to, and let's just say it's going to be the prefix colon, and let's just call this input, because that's what we actually set in as the input a second ago, right? Just what we did. Let's look at this again. There, prefix and whatever the input is. So now if we want to rerun these tests, and it's going to run both of these, two different tests, let's run these to verify. There we go. Both on the string, it equals prefix equals input, and the input, of course, is 49. Now we have a simple client that has an implementation of a specific target for our subject, and we only have 2 contractual obligations. Now I'm going to go through an example first of doing a simple refactoring because I want to do a couple tweaks, and I think with the original piece, we made some changes, but I like showing this that this is the normal operation of us refactoring things. So first of all, the first thing I want to do is make things a little bit more readable, and I'm going to come up here and I am now going to do 2 different imports. I'm going to import static org.junit.assert.asterisk, so all the methods within the assert class. Also, because JUnit and Hamcrest, which is a phonetic matching library, is pretty much tied hand in hand, we usually get this for free when we're using Maven or Gradle, which this example is using. Otherwise, you would need to import the Hamcrest library, which is also done for you with Eclipse if you import the JUnit libraries from Eclipse. It's already included. So I'm going to import the static org.hamcrest.corematchers.asterisk. Now, let's see what that buys us first. So first of all, we know, I've shown you this one in the previous example, which is the assert class.assert equals. Well, assert equals a result and an actual. That's okay, but it's not real phonetic. We could do this simple static import and get what we have here, which is just assert equals a result and actual. But again, not super phonetic. So what I like to do is I'm going to say I want to assert that. And as you see here, we actually already have an assert that method. There's 2 of them. There's actually the actual and the matcher that is included. And I'm going to show you how this works in a second. But we could also show a reason why this may not work. So I'm actually going to do both of them. So first of all, let's do a string at the beginning. So the reason is, let's say input times 49 is what, or 42, which is what our example should be. That's what we should be getting. Now we have a reason why we should have this match. We have our result, but then what we want to do is we want to have a matcher, and we have included in the core matchers one that's called is. And is says, well, is what? The result should be what? And for this example, it should be 49. So now if we look at this example, we're going to say, I'd like to assert that the input is times 42 and the result is 49. Now running this again, it should actually have here. Now what happened? We actually have a problem. We actually had 49 plus 56. Oh, I think I made a mistake. I did. 42 is, I was typing something in between these different inputs, and now both of them work successfully. Although, as you see, hopefully you would see, is that line 28 is a little bit more readable than line 36. However, we're going to change one more thing in the refactoring of this, and we're just going to say that we want to do the same thing with this one, which is the assert that, and we're going to say input should contain a prefix, and the result should be is this actual prefix. Again, now we just have a better way of reading these same unit test cases. Rerunning this test case says that they both work successfully, and we now have a very simple client that relies on a specific target. Now let's start looking at refactoring this into the proxy pattern. Now let's make an assumption here. Let's say, again, we have a subject and we also have a target. Now in the subject, again, let's assume we cannot change this subject because essentially it will break existing APIs. And that's not what we want to do. We want to keep our APIs solid because this is our contractual obligation. Now, if we think about not changing that, okay, what about our target? Well, let's make another assumption again. Let's again say we cannot change anything in this class. Maybe it's a legacy class. Maybe, again, there's some other reason where we do not want to make a change inside of the implementation. And it could be for many reasons. Like I said, maybe it's legacy. Maybe you already have, 100, or let's just say something like 500 legacy lines of code. And we really don't want to touch this. We want to potentially add something or logic to this without actually touching it. Now, let's say we have a task, and our task has been to add some code. Now, I'm going to call this code a piece of advice. So let's say that we have two pieces of advice that we've been given, and we're needing to use a pre-operation. We're going to add whatever kind of input we have, multiplying it by 100 and returning that input. Now, this is going to be a pre-operation for us. We need to do this before any other target executes anything. And let's say we have a pre-operation on a string. So anytime we take a string input, we add the audit prefix to that and then return that. So these are two pieces of advice we need to add. So, well, where do we add them? Well, let's go back to the UML real quick. Now let's look. Now I've added a piece of advice here. Now this advice class is something that we need to actually add before our target. So, I mean, there's a couple things. I mean, if we look at the relationship, I mean, we're not realizing this target. We're not subclassing this target because we cannot modify it. Remember, let's say we can't modify it. And we can't decide to add this as a usage to the target because, again, we cannot modify this target. So how do I create this relationship between the target class, which I cannot modify or don't want to modify, and my advice so that my client can realize the outcome of this advice but not actually have to change any existing code? Well, now comes to the fact, let's actually create something new here. Let's create another class called a proxy. Okay. Now this proxy is in question where this magic is going to happen for us. So for us, what we're going to do is we're going to create a proxy that, of course, is going to realize the subject. And what that means is it's going to implements the subject's interface, which means we have to add all of the contractual methods to this proxy. That's fine. But now, again, how do I get this relationship between the proxy and my target? Actually, I'll move this a little bit here. My target and my actual advice. Well, here's what's going to happen. We are actually going to create an aggregation. So we're going to have an instance of advice in our proxy. Well, you know what else is going to happen though? We're actually going to also have an aggregation of our target. I'm trying to make that a little bit more readable. There we go. Of our target. And really what we're doing by aggregating this, we're really going to delegate our operations over to our target. So we're going to actually be implementing both advice and our target inside of this new proxy class. Now, if this sounds a little new to you on the diagram, let's actually show how we're going to actually implement this by way of, again, the names we've used here. And we'll go back to our code now. And what we're going to do is we're going to not change our client or necessarily our target. We will change this in a minute, but we're not going to modify it yet. And we want to actually have a different result. So starting at the beginning, the first class that we need to modify is our proxy. And our proxy class, it's a simple class, and it's going to implement the specific subject. Okay, right now I implement the subject, and I'm going to implement the two methods because I need to implement those methods. However, they're really not doing anything, right? We have a contractual obligation, but no tying between the two different classes. And to verify this, let's actually go back here and let's change our target to our proxy. Okay, so in our proxy, we are changing the value. That's all we've done. Nothing else has changed. But let's run this. I know we're not going to get the right results, but it's not going to be a compilation error. It's going to be an error with the type of inputs that we actually have, which means not everything's wired together correctly yet. So before we go into this, let's find out what we're missing. So in our proxy, remember, we need two things. So first of all, we need a private. We needed the target, remember. So we're going to create a target, and we'll call this a target. Next, we also need a piece of advice, and we're going to call this advice. So two pieces. Now, of course, we haven't done anything with these yet. So let's do a simple example. Let's actually create a public, simple proxy constructor, and let's not do anything in this constructor yet except for doing this. We're going to first say I need a target equals new target, right? Oops, that gave me twice, sorry. And then we're going to create a advice equals new advice. And the advice now is we've got two different classes. Now, again, we're not doing anything in the constructor that's specific, but we could if we needed to change the operation. But we don't want to do that yet. Let's actually just add what we originally had. So what we originally had was this. We had our target, and our target dot operation returning numeric value, and we do our input. And remember, we actually had our target dot operation returning a string value and input for there. Right? Now, we haven't done anything else. And let's just see if what we've got now is we've got a new proxy. Does our unit test actually pass for what we had before? Yes, it does. We actually have exactly what we had before, but what we're doing is we essentially have not done this yet. We have not implemented our advice. Let me make this a different color real quick just to show. We're going to go with, we're going to add this green advice. There we go, right? So we delegate to the target. That's all we've done. So essentially the target, the client really is actually accessing or really using the proxy. It's really not using the target at this point, although it's using it based on the interface. Now, I'm not going to draw this for here, but this is part of it. Now, what are we missing? we're missing this piece here. We're missing the aggregation for the advice. Now, let's do that. Now, going back to this example and going back to our proxy. So our proxy has our advice. Now, remember what we want to do is we want to add this as a pre-advice. So if we kind of look at this, we're really thinking about getting a integer, we get a result, and we have a advice dot, and remember we have a pre-operation with our input. Okay? And that's fine that we get this result, that we want to do something ahead of time. But we want to be able to use this into our second operation, right? So I'm going to take this result, and the numeric value now is going to be the result. So as you see, we do our pre-operation, and then we do our target operation, and then we return that. So as you see, we've been able to add some other advice and not modify our subject, and we've not had to modify our target at all. Now, going back to this, let's finish this off real quick to say that a string result is equal to the advice dot the pre-operation for the input. All right, there's what we have here. And we're going to take the result and add it to here. Now we have essentially done the second piece. We've now made the advice is an aggregation both for the target and the advice within this proxy. Now, without changing anything else, because we haven't, we assume that we have our, let's call this our initializing our client here. This is our actual client that we've initialized. Now, that's the only thing that actually ends up changing is what we're implementing. And this can be mitigated by many things like using Java EE's CDI, or using Spring, or using Juice. All of these frameworks can implement this. Most specifically, I'll say we're going to use CDI or Spring, can actually take care of this problem. Now, we do have another issue, though, because we have a different expectation than what we had before, but nothing else. So if we actually rerun this, let's look at the errors we're going to get. So in the first one, well, actually, what we needed to do is we actually had a different input from this. It's not really going to be 42. Our outcome now is 742, which really means what? We're actually saying we want to modify our input times 100, which means actually 7 times 100. And now we're going to say our target is going to be our input plus 42, which is 742. Perfect. So if we say it should be input actually times 100 and then times 42 is actually going to be what we're looking at now. And of course, we have a second problem, which is here. Our input, let's zoom in on this real quick, right? Let me show you what happened here. So we expected just to have a prefix and the input, but what we got was a prefix, audit, and input. Now, going back to this, looking at what happened, you may sound, well, shouldn't it have been, let me see, audit, colon, prefix, colon, input. I kind of wanted to do that first, right? I wanted to add it in there first. Well, sort of, but remember, we're getting audit input is the prefix of this, and now the operation takes this, which essentially was going to be prefix colon input, right? That's what we actually have as our input, and prefix goes before that. I'm sorry, we did audit, right? We did audit, and now audit comes first. So we actually have prefix colon audit colon input. Now rerunning this test again shows both of these has successfully passed, which means we have successfully been able to modify the workings or the actual working code of the implementation of our subject without modifying our target class, without modifying our API interface, and yet we still had other operations that we were able to do. Now, to take this one step further on the proxy pattern, we could do something else. Let's actually say that we actually also wanted to do a, let's say we do a post operation. Let's say a post operation, take the input, and let's modify this by 1,000. And let's actually do another one, another post operation on the string. And this is going to take, let's just say this post operation, let's call this a post operation. Okay. Now we've added operations we can do in different locations. So the proxy pattern is super flexible, because now in the proxy, I actually have my target operation, but now I can say, you know what? I want to say an int, let's call this an int result is equal to, rename this, right? Int result is equal to that operation. And now let's say I want to return my advice dot post operation dot int result. Now notice I can actually do several different operations without changing the existing code. This is my post operation. And let's try another example as well. Let's go into saying the string str result equals my string result. And let's do a return, right? Return is my advice dot my post operation dot str result. And again, now I've actually added many operations with this one proxy. Going back to my test, when I go test this, of course it's not going to work. Let's see what the problems are. The problem is now that the value has been modified by 1,000 after the fact. So that means actually we're actually going to say that we're going to modify all of this times 1,000, which gives us 742,000. And I'm going to use this because I like this new Java 7 underscore. So now it should be 742,000 is the result. And in here, we notice we actually have a post operation at the beginning of this. We actually had a prefix, but also a post operation. And that does go onto the outside after our input. Rerunning this test, and now we have successfully added multiple operations both before and after our target operation. But again, we go back to the fact that we have not had to modify our subject nor our target to implement what we have here, which is a proxy pattern delegating the operations to a given target.